Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling night of Dr. Sinister's tales of terror. Tonight, we explore the dread of being alone, when something else is lurking just beyond sight. In Fargo, a woman hears faint footsteps in her empty home, until the presence beside her makes itself known. In Appalachia, a retired man's peaceful solitude is shattered when a monstrous figure watches from the woods. And in River Falls, a woman's boyfriend goes to check the basement. But what calls her name from the dark may not be him at all. 3 stories, 3 souls, and the question that will haunt you long after the tales have ended: are you ever truly alone? Turn down the lights and prepare for terror. The steam rose in thick ghostly plumes from the bubbling hot tub, dissolving into the frigid night air. Mary leaned her head back against the wooden edge, exhaling a satisfied sigh as the heat seeped deep into her bones. The surrounding wilderness was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of branches in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The full moon bathed the clearing in silver, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. She stayed in the water for a while, letting her muscles loosen, allowing herself to enjoy the solitude. The cabin was meant to be a retreat, a place of peace, where she could escape the relentless pace of city life. Out here, there were no cars, no sirens, no hurried conversations, just her, the trees, and the sky. On the second night, she thought she heard something, a faint crunching noise from the edge of the property, just beyond her deck. She paused, listening. It could have been an animal, a deer moving through the underbrush, but something about the sound unsettled her. It was deliberate, careful, as though whatever made it was trying not to be heard. She shook it off, telling herself it was just her nerves, the isolation playing tricks on her. She finished her wine and went inside, locking the door behind her. The next morning, she found footprints in the snow outside her cabin, large, deep, and unmistakably human. They led from the woods to her deck and stopped just beneath her bedroom window. Mary's stomach clenched. The prints weren't there the previous day. She told herself they could be old, but she knew better. She called the sheriff's office, her voice tight with unease. "There's been someone outside my cabin," she said. "I don't know who, but they were right up against my house." The deputy on the other end of the line sighed. "It's probably just a hunter passing through, but I can send someone up to check things out." She thanked them, but the unease didn't fade. That night, she triple-checked her locks before going to bed. Keeping a flashlight on the nightstand, she lay awake for hours, straining to hear beyond the walls of the cabin, but the night remained still. On the 3rd evening, she decided to use the hot tub again. The water was comforting, and for a while she felt her nerves settle. Then, as she was about to get out, she saw him. A figure stood at the tree line, motionless. A tall man, his shoulders broad and stiff, with a burlap sack pulled over his head. 2 dark holes were cut where his eyes should be, staring directly at her. A second passed, then another. Mary's breath hitched in her throat, her body turning rigid in the heat. Her mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe a trick of the light, a tree casting a strange shadow. But no, he was real, and he was watching her. She shot up, the cold air shocking her damp skin. Fumbling out of the water, she grabbed her towel, wrapped it around herself, and darted toward her cabin, her bare feet crunching against the frozen deck. Her hands trembled as she yanked the sliding glass door open and slammed it shut behind her, locking it with a shaky click. When she dared to look outside again, the man was gone. For the next few nights, she barely slept. Small sounds outside made her bolt upright in bed. A branch snapping, the wind pushing against the side of the house. A faint scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like something being dragged across the wood of her porch. On the fifth night, she woke, suddenly. A sound, a breath, wet and shuddering, was close. Too close. The darkness pressed in around her. She turned her head slowly, her heart a pounding drum in her ears. He was there, standing over her, the bag still on his head, the eye holes revealing nothing but blackness underneath. He was so close, she could hear the rasp of his breath, smell the damp, rotting fabric of his mask. A scream clawed its way up her throat, but before she could make a sound, a rough, gloved hand clamped over her mouth. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the gleam of something sharp reflecting the moonlight. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the old glass panes with a force that made Claire pull her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Winter in Fargo was relentless. The snowdrifts reached halfway up her door, and the streets outside had gone silent hours ago. The neighbors had turned in for the night, their houses dark and empty-looking beneath the weight of the cold. She sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly, her book resting open on her lap. The only other sound was the quiet hum of the furnace kicking on, its vents blowing warm air into the house. It was a peaceful night, or at least it should have been. Then she heard something she shouldn't be hearing. Faint, distant, almost too soft to notice at first. A footstep, no, two, somewhere in the house. The unmistakable creak of weight settling on an old wooden floorboard. Claire froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of her book. She listened, her heart pounding in her ears. Maybe it was the house settling, she told herself. Maybe it was the wind pressing against the foundation. Then silence. For a long time, she sat like that, waiting, her breath shallow. Nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more footsteps. The tension in her body eased, but not completely. It was late. She was tired. Her mind was probably playing tricks on her. Shaking her head, she forced a chuckle and picked up her book again. She wouldn't let a creaky floorboard ruin her evening. The next night, the sound returned. This time, it was closer. Claire had just finished washing the dishes, her hands still damp as she moved into the living room. Then she heard them again, light, deliberate footsteps echoing in the hallway behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway was empty. The lights were on. Nothing moved. She stood there, heart hammering, waiting for something to happen. The air felt different now, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Slowly she walked toward the hallway, peering into the dimness beyond. She checked every room. Nothing was out of place. Still, the feeling didn't leave her. By the third night, Claire had started double-checking the locks before bed. She made sure all the windows were latched, all the curtains drawn. She kept a flashlight by her bed and her phone within arm's reach. But no matter what precautions she took, the footsteps continued, a slow, shuffling sound that seemed to come from different parts of the house. Sometimes they echoed from the hallway, other times from the kitchen. Once, she was certain she heard them just outside her bedroom door. She had tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the truth was settling in. She wasn't alone. On the fourth night, something changed. It was past midnight, and she was in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent. For the first time in days, she started to relax. Maybe, she thought, whatever had been happening had stopped. Maybe it really had been in her head. Then she heard a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. A sound like someone breathing words just beneath the level of understanding. Her blood turned to ice. The whisper came from the hallway, just outside her bedroom. She sat up slowly, her entire body tense. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the atmosphere had changed. She wanted to turn on the light, but she was afraid of what she might see. The whispering stopped. Then the footsteps returned, louder this time, more deliberate. They moved toward her bedroom door. She held her breath, every muscle in her body locking in place. The doorknob rattled, then stopped. She waited. Nothing. Eventually, she fell into a restless sleep, the exhaustion overtaking her fear. But the dread remained. On the fifth night, Claire sat on her couch, the fireplace flickering low. She had poured herself a glass of wine, determined to unwind, to ignore the stupid paranoia that had latched onto her. The book in her lap was a familiar comfort, an old favorite she had read countless times. And then she felt something, a presence. It was watching her. The air in the room seemed to shift, as if something unseen had entered, had stepped too close. Her skin prickled, her fingers tightening around her book. She swallowed, her throat dry. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, but nothing was there. Then she heard breathing, software measured, just behind her. The sound of footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, coming from directly behind the couch. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The pressure in the air thickened, pressing down on her, and then she saw it. The cushion beside her depressed, as if something, had just sat down. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. The sound that came from her throat shattered the silence, carrying through the out into the frozen night until it was swallowed whole by the wind. The wind outside howled against the old house, shaking the windows in their frames. The cold seeped through the cracks, chilling the air inside just enough to make Emma pull her sweater tighter around her shoulders. River Falls, Wisconsin, was known for its quiet, its stillness. But tonight, something about that stillness felt wrong. She sat curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Then the lights flickered, once, twice. She froze, staring up at the ceiling as the overhead light trembled, dimming and brightening again in a stuttering, erratic pulse. The television flickered along with it, the screen momentarily turning to static before stabilizing. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from the hallway leading to the kitchen. A shuffle, a faint creak, like weight shifting on an old floorboard. Emma swallowed, forcing a laugh. "Jesus, get a grip," she muttered, shaking her head. But she reached for her phone anyway, her fingers moving fast over the screen as she called her boyfriend. "Hey babe, what's up?" Tom answered after a few rings, his voice warm, familiar. "Are you busy?" "Not really." "What's wrong?" She hesitated, glancing around the dimly lit room. "I think there's something weird going on. The lights keep flickering, and I swear I just heard something in the house. I probably just need you to tell me I'm being crazy." Tom chuckled. "You're probably being crazy, but I'll come over anyway. Be there soon." Relief washed over her. "Thanks. Just hurry." Tom arrived 20 minutes later, shaking snow from his coat as he stepped inside. Emma threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his shoulder. His warmth, his scent, everything about him felt safe, real. "All right, let's investigate," he teased, kissing the top of her head. They settled onto the couch, sharing a couple of beers. flipping through channels while the wind rattled outside. Emma started to relax, her earlier nerves easing as Tom stretched an arm around her. Then the lights flickered again. Tom sighed. "All right, I'll go check the power box." Emma tensed. "Do you have to?" He grinned, standing up. "Unless you want to sit in the dark all night." She watched as he grabbed the flashlight from the counter and made his way toward the basement door. The old wooden steps groaned under his weight as he descended. Emma sat stiffly, fingers gripping her beer bottle. Minutes passed. The house felt impossibly silent now, except for the occasional hum of the fridge and the distant whistling wind. Then she heard his voice. "Babe, come check this out." Her stomach clenched. "What is it?" She called back. "You need to see this." Even though Tom was there, she didn't fancy the idea of going in the basement. She stood slowly, making her way to the basement door. The light switch did nothing as she flicked it. The basement remained cloaked in darkness, the weak glow of Tom's flashlight barely visible from below. The door creaked as she stepped inside. The air was thick, damp. The wooden stairs groaned beneath her careful steps. The door swung shut behind her. She jumped, her breath catching in her throat. The wind, she told herself, just the wind. Then Tom's voice came again. "You need to see this." The power went out. Everything plunged into darkness. "Where are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Silence. Then, "Look over here." The lights flickered, casting a brief, stuttering glow over the basement. Her eyes darted to the far corner. Tom sat slumped against the wall. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, his head lolling to one side. His eyes were open, unblinking, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The flickering light made it seem as though his face was shifting, moving, a moment frozen in terror. Emma gasped, stumbling back. Her breath came in quick, ragged gulps. "Look over here!" Tom's voice rang out again. But Tom's lips didn't move. The voice was coming from the other side of the basement. A cold dread spread through her veins, her body frozen in place. The lights flickered again, and in the momentary darkness, she heard something move. She turned and ran up the stairs to the basement door. It wouldn't open. The lights buzzed back to life, just long enough for her to turn around and see the shadow approaching the bottom of the stairs, hunched, too tall. Arms too long, its head tilted, unnaturally jerking as if testing its range of motion. The moment its form became clear, the lights flickered out again, and then it spoke. "Babe, come check this out." Emma's scream tore through the house, swallowed by the dark, lost beneath the howling wind of river falls. The wind cut through the bare trees, whistling like a distant scream as Nathan trudged through the snow-covered underbrush, rifle slung over his shoulder. The mountains of Appalachia had been his retreat for the past 6 months, a promise of peace and solitude after 30 years of working a job that drained him more with each passing year. Here, in his modest cabin, nestled in the Virginia wilderness, he had found something close to contentment. But tonight, something felt different. He was a seasoned hunter, knew the sounds of these woods like the rhythm of his own breath, the rustle of squirrels, the chatter of birds, the wind shifting through brittle branches. Those were all familiar comforts. But this was something else. A howl echoed through the trees. It wasn't the high-pitched cry of a coyote or the mournful wail of a wolf. It was something deeper, guttural, almost unnatural. It made the hairs on his arms stand on end, and his grip on the rifle tightened. He turned in the direction of the sound, scanning the darkening tree line, but saw nothing. A thick, uneasy silence followed. Nathan exhaled sharply, pushing down the nagging unease creeping into his chest. He'd call it a day. Whatever was out there could have the night. He turned and headed back toward the cabin, his boots crunching through the snow. A few nights later, he was outside chopping wood for the fire, his breath coming in misty plumes against the frigid air. The steady rhythm of the axe splitting through the logs was almost meditative. The scent of pine and cold earth surrounded him, grounding him in the simple repetition of the task. Then he heard it again. The same howl, low, resonant, too deep to be anything he could easily name. It sent a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. He hesitated, the axe frozen in his grip. The sound came from deeper in the woods this time, but it was closer than before. Nathan swallowed, steeled himself, and finished splitting the last few logs before gathering them up in his arms. Whatever was out there, it didn't need to know he was rattled. Back inside the cabin, he bolted the door behind him, the warmth of the fire, a welcome contrast to the cold dread still clinging to him. The scent of butter and sizzling meat filled the air as he stood at the stove, turning over the thick porterhouse steak with practiced ease. The potatoes were nearly done, golden and crisp in the pan, and the string beans simmered gently in a pot. A movie played in the background, some old western, the sound of gunfire and galloping horses filling the small cabin. It was a good night, a normal night. And then the howl came again. Nathan stiffened, the spatula hovering over the pan. It was closer this time, too close. The sound seemed to curl through the very walls of the cabin, vibrating through the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. He moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to peer outside. Nothing. The trees stood tall and skeletal against the moonlight, the snow reflecting a pale glow. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Maybe it was just a particularly large wolf passing through, but deep down, he didn't believe that. The howl came again, this time right outside the house. Nathan grabbed his shotgun from where it rested near the door, his pulse hammering in his throat. He stood still, listening, waiting. Then, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. A low growl rumbled through the stillness, deep enough to vibrate in his chest. He edged toward the door, heart pounding, and with slow precision, cracked it open just enough to get a look outside. Large footprints, bigger than any animal he had ever seen, pressed deep into the snow. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. Then movement, a massive shadow shifting between the trees. And then he saw it. It stood on two legs, covered in thick black fur, its elongated snout revealing sharp, glistening fangs. Its eyes gleamed like molten silver, locked onto him with an intelligence that was all too human. Nathan's grip on the shotgun tightened, his instincts screaming at him to slam the door and never open it again. The creature took a step forward. Nathan didn't hesitate. He slammed the door, bolted it shut, and backed away, the shotgun raised. He could hear it moving outside, its heavy footsteps crunching through the snow, pacing, circling. The growling became louder, more insistent, and then a deafening crash. The door exploded inward, splinters flying across the room. Nathan fired without thinking, the shotgun's blast tearing into the creature's shoulder. It roared, stumbling back, but it didn't fall. He fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. The thing let out a guttural, snarling sound, and finally retreated, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. Nathan stood there, the gun still raised, his breath ragged. He could still hear it moving through the trees, the snap of branches fading into the night. He didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he had packed what he could carry, loaded up his truck, and left that cabin behind, the place that was supposed to be his sanctuary. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Some things were meant to be left behind. And whatever was out there in the mountains of Appalachia, he had no intention of ever meeting it again.